Welcome back, friends, to another Before You Read lecture, this time on the book of Hosea. As with a previous lecture on Amos, this lecture is intended to give you a sense of Hosea's persona as a prophet, his basic message, and a few suggestions about how to read the book of Hosea most effectively. The prophet Hosea was active during the reign of King Jeroboam in the north, which means that he, like Amos, was engaged in prophetic ministry during the middle of the 8th century BCE. Hosea's message concerned life in Israel, similar to that of Amos, but he appears to have been from the northern kingdom himself, unlike Amos, who came from the south. There are two basic parts to Hosea. The first 3 chapters discuss Hosea's marriage to Gomer as an analogy for Israel's relationship to God. Chapters 4 through 14 engage a variety of political and religious affairs. Chapter 4 provides a more general account of Israel's failures, while chapters 5 through 13 enumerate more specific shortcomings. We don't get a ton of biographical details about Hosea, but one detail is significant, especially in the first 3 chapters: Hosea's marriage to Gomer. As the text makes clear, Gomer was promiscuous, a fact well known by Hosea. Whether Hosea knew of this aspect of Gomer before they got married is unclear. Likewise, it is unclear if Gomer was a prostitute or simply serially unfaithful to Hosea. The text of Hosea also indicates that Hosea had 3 children with Gomer, 2 sons and a daughter. Each of Hosea's children is given a symbolic name. His first son, Jezreel, refers to the summer place of kings where King Jehu slaughtered Jezebel. His first daughter, Lo Ramuha, means not pitied or not loved, and his second son, Lo Ami, means not my people. Hosea's family, his wife, and his children all function as a symbol or a prophetic performance for Israel's relationship with God. Israel takes the role of the promiscuous, unfaithful life. God takes the role of the spurned lover, and the 3 children symbolize the fruit or the consequences of Israel's unfaithfulness. Israel will not be shown any love or pity, and they will no longer be God's people. As mentioned above, the analogy of marriage dominates the first 3 chapters of Hosea. This is an analogy of Israel's relationship to God. So, according to Hosea, how has Israel been unfaithful? There seem to be 2 main issues. First, the marriage analogy is used to critique Israel's alliance with other nations, especially Assyria and Egypt. In this analogy, these foreign powers function as Israel's lovers, which lead her to commit adultery against her husband, God. Israel entered into an alliance with Assyria during the reign of King Jehu. This alliance led to an increase in Israel's power and prosperity. Eventually, however, Israel switched its loyalty from Assyria to Aram after the assassination of Jeroboam's son Zechariah. Ultimately, both Aram and Israel were destroyed by Assyria. For the prophet Hosea, Israel's actions amounted to more than political intrigue. Hosea interpreted them as tantamount to idolatry. Israel was trusting its human negotiated alliances with other nations rather than trusting God. The second issue, or at least, and it is related to the first, concerns Israel's worship of Baal. In the ancient Near Eastern context, the god Baal was recognized as a fertility god, which meant that the food and drink came from Baal's provision. So at least in the eyes of Hosea, Israel had come to regard Baal as the source of their sustenance in life, not God. Like Amos, Hosea is very critical of the cultic system. In fact, Hosea seems to imply that the system of offering sacrifices may even have led to Israel's self-contentment. Israel came to think that sacrifices were enough to ensure their protection, but God wanted more commitment and faithfulness. I'd like to say a few additional things about Hosea's message before offering some reading strategies. It is worth pausing to consider that Hosea's message appeals to the institution of marriage to illustrate the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. There were other options, of course, like international treaties made between different nations at the time, but that's not the type of covenant Hosea appeals to. Rather, by drawing on marriage, Hosea's message is far more intimate and personal. And this has, I think, important theological consequences. On one hand, Hosea presents God as emotive, vulnerable, and capable of being injured by Israel. The God of the universe appears as a spurned lover. That's a pretty powerful picture of God. On the other hand, the analogy of God as a husband or lover has certain limits. Hosea replicates many of the cultural assumptions of the day as it relates to marriage and divorce. As a husband, Hosea is able to humiliate and even kill his wife because of her adultery. He and he alone can issue a certificate of divorce. Clearly, there are power dynamics at play. It is easy to think of God as the exemplary husband and thus validate all sorts of problematic assumptions about what a husband can and should do to his wife. Some interpreters fear that Hosea authorizes violence against women, or at least it doesn't go far enough to prevent it. To focus your engagement with Hosea, I suggest you read chapters 1 through 4 and then chapter 14. As noted above, this will give you a good sense of the marriage analogy at play and the general indictment against Israel in chapter 4. Then chapter 14 outlines an appeal for Israel to return and an exhortation concerning God's righteousness. As you read, I invite you to consider these questions. What does the marriage analogy teach you about God? What are the strengths of this analogy, and what are its weaknesses? Second, what is the role of wilderness in Hosea's message? I imagine that this book will get you feeling all sorts of things: fascination, anger, confusion, and so many more. Pay attention to these feelings as you read. I can't wait to hear what you've discovered through your reading. Now get to it.